Well, thank you all for coming. Let's begin. Stories. What are they good for? Certainly, everybody loves a good story. But what if our storytelling, our narrative practices, are important for reasons other than their power to entertain? Actually, there are lots of important things that storytelling does for us. We share experiences through stories. We build trust, cultivate norms, facilitate thinking in new and imaginative ways, and forge emotional connections with others. For these reasons, major businesses now recognize the importance of storytelling. Indeed, some think that communal storytelling will become the key ingredient to managing communications, education, training, and innovation in the 21st century. I didn't make that up, I found it on the web. In tonight's lecture, I motivate the possibility that our storytelling practices may be important for a different reason. I will be introducing you to my narrative practice hypothesis. It says, in essence, that storytelling practices might ground our everyday ability for making sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons. If true, this excludes another extremely influential possibility, that the roots of our capacity for doing this are built in, that we are simply born with everything we need for understanding other minds and our own. This view is known as the theory of mind module hypothesis, and it is my arch rival. Why should we care which of these two hypotheses is true? Well, if our capacity to make sense of ourselves and others is not built in, if it depends on engaging in special kinds of social practices, then this influences how we should think about a number of important topics. It matters for our understanding of certain mental dysfunctions and how we might attempt to treat them. I will say more about this at the close of the lecture. But it also matters when it comes to deciding which kinds of educational opportunities we ought to provide for children. Furthermore, if our capacity for making sense of ourselves and others is not wholly built in, then this raises the tantalizing possibility that even as adults, we might be able to improve upon and enhance it. So, all in all, the stakes are pretty high. With this in mind, I would like your help in adjudicating between these rival hypotheses, hence your voting devices. This is how we'll proceed. I'll introduce each proposal in turn. After those introductions, you will have a chance to vote if you think the hypothesis is true or false. And for the hardcore philosophers in the audience, I'll settle for possibly true or false. So read those terms that way. And you'll do that by pressing 1 for true or possibly true, and 2 for false. Okay. After that, we'll look at some challenges facing both proposals. We will review them in the light of emerging empirical evidence. So this is the element when John mentioned the fact that we'll be philosophy engaging with the sciences. And after that, you'll have one more chance to vote, if I haven't won your hearts somewhere along the line. But don't feel free to vote against me. My own mother did when I was rehearsing this with her on telephone across the Atlantic. I did win her back in the end, but probably not on the empirical evidence. Before we get going, it is important to get clear about what making sense of ourselves and others in terms of reason actually involves, since that's what you're going to be assessing, and just who can and who can't do it. So to better understand reason explanations, it helps to think about how we might ask and answer that infamous riddle. You might know it. Why did the chicken cross the road? Now, what's interesting about this is this might be asked because we are puzzled by someone else's reasons. So we might wonder why somebody else is doing what they're doing. Or equally, we might be puzzled by our own reasons and ask the same sort of question. What answer might we give to this question? If the internet is to be believed, many famous minds have been vexed by this very question down the ages. Julius Caesar says, to come, to see, to conquer. Plato, for the greater good. Aristotle, it is the nature of chickens to cross roads. Karl Marx, it was a historical inevitability. Darwin, chickens over great periods of time have been naturally selected in such a way that they are now genetically disposed to cross roads. And perhaps, just a bit more morbidly, Ernest Hemingway, to die in the rain. The keen-eyed will note that not all of these answers count as giving a reason from the chicken's point of view. Aristotle, Marx, and Darwin don't tell us anything about the chicken's reasons for crossing the road. They explain its crossing by appeal to other forces or factors. And I'm really not quite so sure about Hemingway's answer. But what if we stick to the time-honored answer to this question to get to the other side? Even assuming that it picks out the chicken's reason, this answer does not tell us nearly enough. Knowing this, we don't know enough to really understand why the chicken crossed the road. Well, perhaps the chicken wanted something on the other side. Or perhaps the chicken feared something on this side. Or perhaps it hoped getting to the other side would achieve something in itself. Or perhaps it believed getting to the other side was necessary in order to do something else. What this shows is that in order to make sense of why somebody acted, we need to fill in the details of their story. A major part of doing so involves characterizing the person's particular mindset. Being able to do this competently requires understanding, there we go, a range of mental attitudes. This is beliefs, desire, hope, fears, the ones I've just mentioned. And this is absolutely crucial for what comes later, how such attitudes can interrelate in complex ways. Now, this capacity is sometimes called a theory of mind, or a mind-reading ability, not the extraordinary Darren Brown type, but an ordinary, everyday way of getting at the contents of other people's minds. It is also known as folk psychology. This latter name neutrally reminds us that what we are interested in is really simply our everyday understanding of people. I much prefer the last one for reasons that you will see as we go along. Now, it probably won't have escaped your notice that chickens don't act for reasons, and they don't make sense of themselves or others in terms of reasons. Interestingly, this is also apparently beyond the abilities of our closest living relatives, as this next film clip shows.
One of the big questions about the difference between chimp minds and ours is whether they have a concept of mind.
Wait a minute, I'm trying to give it to the baby.
Does Megan here think of me as another thinking creature? Does she think of herself as a thinking creature? Danny Pavanelli would argue not, and he spent years with these guys.
Well, if chimps can't do this, what about members of our own species? Is this something that all humans can do?
Today, I'm joining Candy Peterson and her team to find out. While we watch on a video link-up, next door, different aged children are being put to the test.
Here, which one looks happy?
Can they put themselves in someone else's mind? Bianca has just turned 3.
Now let's have a look at this box. Do you know what's in the box? Look at this. There's a pig inside the box, see? Okay, I'll put him back in. Now here is a lady. She hasn't seen inside the box before.
Now she knows there's a pig inside, will Bianca be able to see the box from the lady's point of view?
Does the lady know what's inside the box? She does?
She doesn't understand that if you haven't seen something, you can't possibly know it.
Bianca's too young to know the lady would think differently. She hasn't yet developed a theory of mind.
Do you know what's in there?
But Ruby is 5.
Let's have a look in there. Now here comes a lady.
And now this is the crucial test.
Does she know what's in there?
Person who hasn't seen in it. And she's very confident.
Stormed
she
it in,
knows they
yeah.
can't. They don't know.
So she's there, she's got it.
She's got it fully, yeah.
And she's smiling too when she
Yeah.
answers. She's pretty confident.
She knows it, yeah.
Okay, so what this tells us, if this evidence is trusted, is that by age 5, if development is typical, the basics for making sense of others in terms of reasons are already becoming securely in place. But this is not true for everyone. Although most of us take the ability for granted, indeed we hardly even notice it, not everyone has it. Here's a passage from Haddon's award-winning The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. It gives insight, albeit fictional, into the world of a 15-year-old boy with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism. I find people confusing. This is for two main reasons. The first main reason is that people do a lot of talking without using any words. Siobhan says that if you raise one eyebrow, it can mean lots of different things. It can mean, I want to do sex with you. And it can also mean, I think what you just said was very stupid. Siobhan also says that if you close your mouth and breathe out loudly, through your nose, it can mean that you're relaxed, or that you're bored, or that you're angry, and it all depends on how much air comes out of your nose and how fast you are, and how you are sitting, and what you said just before, and hundreds of other things that are too complicated to work out in a few seconds. Most of us are not impaired in this way. We find it easy to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons. Now that I think we have a handle a little bit on what this question involves, we can ask, what is the basis of this ability? How do we come by it? And it's time now to meet our first hypothesis, contender number 1. The big idea, inspired by the observation that making sense of someone's reasons for acting involves getting at their story that we saw earlier, a number of philosophers are attracted to the idea that we characteristically understand other people's behavior, and even our own, by situating particular acts within a narrative. Taking this idea a step further, I advance what I called my narrative practice hypothesis. Actually, in the literature, I call it the narrative practice hypothesis, but my son convinced me to personalize it for this occasion. It says that engaging in storytelling practices, narrative practices, is the normal route by which we acquire the capacity for understanding ourselves and others in terms of reasons. We come by this capacity by jointly engaging with stories of a particular kind, those that put on display how mental states figure in the lives, history, and larger projects of their owners. Not every story has these features. For example, I could tell you a tale about the antics of a meandering balloon. In relating its adventures, I might not make any mention of mental states, projects, or the likes, and I could go on for some time. Still, most of the stories that we find in books or hear in conversation are of the right kind to talk about people's projects, mental states, and attitudes. What makes those sorts of stories special is that by engaging with them, we become acquainted with the possible relationships between mental states, such as beliefs, desires, hopes, and fears. Although other details will vary in the stories, such as the characters, the setting, the plot, showing how mental states can relate are constant features of these types of story. Now, there is good reason to think that stories of the relevant kind must be narrated in language by verbal means, as depicted in this act of storytelling, The Boyhood of Raleigh by Millais. And then when we see this painting, we are immediately reminded of the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. But the painting itself does not tell that story. If we imagine early Homo sapiens trying to tell the story Little Red Riding Hood through the medium of paint, our artist immediately encounters difficulty in representing the thoughts, beliefs, and motives of the characters, as well as the relationship between them. A picture may be worth 1,000 words, but sometimes 1,000 pictures cannot match a few choice words. But a painting by itself could not convey stories of the relevant kind, if that's right. But compare this version of the story. Little Red Riding Hood learns from the woodcutter that her grandmother is poorly. She wants to make her grandmother feel better. She's a nice, caring child. And she thinks that a basket of sweets will help. So she takes a basket through the woods to her grandmother's house. And what we get as a sort of Shakespearean aside Beliefs and desires lead to actions, but this is not actually stated anywhere in the story. We learned this in the process of digesting these stories. When she arrives there, she sees a wolf in her grandmother's bed, but she falsely believes that the wolf is her grandmother. And another lesson, appearances can be deceiving. When she realizes it's a wolf, she's frightened and she runs away. And this is because she knows that wolves eat people. The wolf, who indeed wants to eat her, leaps out of the bed and runs after her, trying to catch her. Stories of this type, I want to claim, give us the know-how for making sense of ourselves and others. They manage to do this without explicitly stating any of these rules, but it's by acquainting ourselves with them that we come to integrate this knowledge. Many animals create external structures that shape their environments. Spiders fashion webs, beavers build dams. These creations, in turn, influence and shape the animals that create them. The driving idea behind my narrative practice hypothesis is that the same is true of humans. We create communal artifacts, stories with special properties, because, like Little Red Riding Hood, these feature in our shared storytelling practices. They ground our capacity to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons. And now, I'm afraid, it's unfortunate for me, judgment time. So we will now turn to the voting process. So thanks for bringing up the lights. So I will ask you now, the clock's already running, so 20 seconds in order to make your decision. Do you think that the narrative practice hypothesis is true or false? Or possibly true? I'm doing pretty well. I'm going to have to try and shift this before we get to the end of the lecture. Okay, very good. Thank you, Joanna. Okay. But we're not done. I can't have things my own way. Psychology teaches me that if you've only heard one account, you're going to want to vote for that anyway, independently of the fact that you came to see me tonight. So let me give you the other view. And again, I warn you that having shown this to my own mother, this is where she turned. Okay. So what is the main rival? I said it earlier. The main rival, known as theory, is so good that they actually named it twice, claims that we make sense of ourselves and others using a theory of mind. And a theory of mind is a set of principles that outlines very general psychological laws. Our tacit grasp of these laws tells us how mental states must relate in the bringing about of actions. And here's an example of such a law. If A wants P and believes that doing Q will bring about P, then, all else being equal, A will do Q. Now, that is very similar to the principle we saw earlier, that beliefs and desires promote action, but now it is explained in terms of a rule. London cabbies must acquire what is known as the knowledge. They must learn, I've discovered from the internet again, 320 routes or runs in London, and it normally takes them between 2 and 4 years to learn all of these. That's pretty tough work, but we can easily imagine that this specialized competence is set down in a set of rules and housed in a dedicated device. I'm sure you've seen one of these. A TomTom is just such a thing. It enables its users to expertly navigate roads in the same way that it's conjectured that we use a theory of mind module to navigate the social world. But how do we come by this kind of innate knowledge? Well, this will go back a bit. According to Plato, innate knowledge comes from what we learned in a previous life. Thus, how to navigate the London streets having navigated the London streets in a previous life, could explain why today's cabbie is born with such knowledge in this life, if we assume that he had that innate capacity. Quoting Chomsky, Leibniz argued that Plato's conception of innate knowledge is basically correct, though it must be, quoting Leibniz, purged of the error of pre-existence. But how, he could not really say. Chomsky thinks modern biology offers us a way to do so. The genetic endowment constitutes what Plato thought we remember from an earlier existence. And we are told now that recent history is far too short to produce significant changes in the human genome. So the genesis of these mental modules is assumed to have occurred during the million or so years preceding modern recorded history, the late Stone Age or the Pliocene. So forging, on this account, a theory of mind module would have happened roughly around these dates in human prehistory. You can see not too far ago. The idea is that theory of mind modules emerged in hominid evolution as an adaptive response to an increasingly complex social environment. If this is true, then our ability to make sense of ourselves and others is based in a built-in theory of mind module and not derived from our shared practices. Such a module is just one special tool, one blade, in the Swiss Army knife of the mind that we inherited from our hominid ancestors. And so yet again, we come to a judgment point. And I must ask you again, what do you think now? Is the theory of mind module hypothesis true? The clock is ticking. I know what you're going to answer, Chris. Well, there you go. Fickle. Okay. Actually, I predicted that too. But we're not done yet. We have one more go at this. So I want to review 3 pieces of evidence before we're finished and see if I can persuade you to reverse that dreadful decision that some of you just made. Okay. I'm putting up a few quotes from Jerry Fodor, and I'll explain what these mean here. So I won't be reading what's on the screen. Essentially, Fodor's challenge is this. By the way, for those of you who don't know him, Fodor is a rather famous philosopher who defends this sort of view. Fodor's challenge to me is this. If our capacity for understanding reasons is universal, then it can't be grounded in storytelling practices. And this is because such practices are local and may vary in important ways across cultures. If this is right, the idea that the capacity is built in looks pretty much like a sure bet. And so I want to ask before we go on, is this right? Is the capacity for explaining ourselves in terms of reasons really a human universal? There have been relatively few cross-cultural studies on this topic, but those that exist reveal important differences between Western and African and Asian populations with respect to performance on false belief tests, tests of the sort that we saw earlier in the video clip. Now note from this, here's one taking children from West Africa and Papua New Guinea. What's really interesting here is to note the age ranges. We were saying earlier that children had reliably, by 5, picked up the capacity in the West. And here we have 6-year-olds and 4 to 8-year-olds from those other populations. And yet, compared to Westerners, and this is the important highlighted data, in many of these tests, they're performing either below or near chance. So that's interesting in itself. But in any case, even if the capacity for understanding reasons is culturally universal, that would not settle the issue. Some human practices, such as agriculture, are more or less universal. And this is because agricultural practice has a long history, dating back to at least 10,000 years ago. Still, no one supposes that we have a built-in agricultural module. Notably, like agriculture, the practice of storytelling is also sufficiently ancient. The oldest known narrative, the Epic of Gilgamesh, dates back 5,000 years ago, but the practice is probably much older still. Now, they say what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The emergence of modern humans out of Africa sets a date at about 100,000 years ago by which any universal inherited modules would have had to have been fully formed and in place in our species. But if so, something is amiss with the dates on the accounts for the theory of mind story. For even proponents of modular theories of mind admit that it's only around 50,000 years ago that fully modern theory of mind abilities evolve, and that a theory of mind had in all likelihood evolved by 40,000 years ago, but before this time there is yet no clear evidence for it. Now, one of the prominent defenders of these views, Baron Cohen, has argued that theory of mind modules must have been in place earlier. Well, that is one option. Another option is simply to deny that theory of mind modules exist, full stop. I would say, at the very least, the evidence from prehistory does not give us any particular reason to believe in the existence of such things, despite the fact that we would have to postulate them. Now, switching from prehistory, see if we can get a grip on the issues by looking at developmental psychology. And a very standard objection that may have crossed the minds of some people in the audience to my narrative practice hypothesis is that it puts the cart before the horse. Surely, its opponents say, children must already have theory of mind abilities, otherwise they wouldn't be able to appreciate the special kinds of stories that the narrative practice hypothesis claims enables them to understand reasons. To understand the story of Little Red Riding Hood, one must, for example, grasp that the girl falsely believes that the wolf is her grandmother. We've seen that. Now, it is certainly true that to engage in the relevant storytelling practices, children must have some understanding of mental states. I don't deny that. But my narrative practice hypothesis assumes that this will be partial, limited, and piecemeal. Thus, it does not follow that children must have a prior and fully fledged capacity for understanding reasons. Nor does it follow that their partial understanding of mental states equates to them having any kind of theory of mind module. So how does that response square with the other evidence from developmental child psychology? Well, I'm gratified to tell you that 5- and 6-year-old children who are old enough to pass the false belief test still have problems understanding how beliefs are acquired, how beliefs interact with desires, and the emotional consequences of false beliefs. So elaborating on this last point, it has been shown that 5-year-olds often do realize that Little Red Riding Hood does not at first know that the wolf is dressed up as her grandmother. Yet these same children, young children, mistakenly state that Little Red Riding Hood would be afraid of her grandmother. And this suggests they haven't fully integrated their understanding of how mental states relate at this stage. I think it's actually also noteworthy, in the light of this evidence, that the age of 5 years marks a turning point in children's narrative skills, with further developments continuing to gradually take place throughout the school years. Okay, so one more piece of important empirical evidence I want to look at, and this you might have thought would be a winner for my opponents. What does the neuroscientific evidence say? This is Rebecca Sachs from MIT, the field leader in theory of mind brain research. Her brain imaging experiments have pinpointed one specific brain region that is selectively active in the relevant tasks of understanding minds in complex ways. This region is not similarly active in other tasks that involve assessing more general, socially relevant facts about persons. So, does this support the idea that we have a dedicated theory of mind module housed in this part of our brains? No. Sachs is quite clear that her evidence is consistent with the brain region in question acquiring its specialized role late in development. Indeed, she notes that the selectivity for thinking about people's thoughts emerges in this region between ages 6 and 11 years. In a bid to understand what might drive this process, Sachs and colleagues take seriously the recent hint that middle childhood is a critical time for interactions between language and theory of mind. Or I'd like to say theory of folk psychological abilities. Indeed, these researchers explicitly recognize that these new findings present, and these findings are dated 2009, present a challenge to this existence of an innate and early maturing theory of mind module. So now, having reviewed those 3 little items of evidence, I'll give you one more opportunity to save yourselves and change your mind. So I ask you now, whether you think, which of these 2 hypotheses would you support now, 1 or 2? The clock's still running. That's the way it was working. Thank you very much. Check's in the post. Okay. So I'm going to round this off now and bring it home. We're going to just look for, very briefly, at some of the big stakes, and then I will take some questions. These issues matter because it is widely supposed that the problems that people with autism have in understanding minds are best explained by faulty neural circuitry underpinning their theory of mind module. This gives us a specific hard target, a unique and locatable source of the dysfunctions we see in autistic individuals. It sets us on the path for finding a single troublemaker, a kind of Professor Moriarty. But if theory of mind modules don't exist, then they can't be the root cause of these dysfunctions. Does this mean that if that's true, one worrying thought might be, does this mean that a better understanding the role of the brain in autistic dysfunctions is unimportant? No. My motto is, brains, don't leave home without them. I tell my students this all the time. Nevertheless, focusing on the brain is to miss the bigger picture. It is to fail to attend to what may be going wrong in our shared practices that I conjecture are the true source of our everyday competence for making sense of ourselves and others. Inspired by this idea, a number of successful therapies are being developed and used that work by making targeted adjustments to our interactions. It is interesting to note that the Romanian orphans, for example, who had no neurological deficits, exhibited the same clinical features as children with autism. Recognizing that our sociocultural practices matter for everyday understanding of minds is not just important for treating mental dysfunctions. If the competence is not innate, then we must ask which sorts of structured opportunities must be put in place to ensure that children can best develop these capacities. The bottom line is that to treat mental disorders and to provide the right educational opportunities for children and possibly adults, we need to discover more about the precise ways that narrative practice foster our abilities for making sense of ourselves and others. Knowing this is important for those in any line of work or any walk of life who must understand and respond sensitively to someone's beliefs, desires, and motivations. I assume that this is most, if not all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Jeremy Ridgman. I'm the head of the School of Humanities, within which philosophy, I'm very privileged to say, sits here at the University of Hertfordshire. It's my job at the moment now to invite you to pose any questions that you might have for Dan. There are a couple of roving mics, and if you could wait once you've been selected for that mic to arrive, that would be very helpful. So, the floor is yours. We have one question down here, I think.
Thanks, Dan. That was very interesting. What do you feel about a hybrid form of theory? It's a bit binary, isn't it?
So a hybrid form being that you think we might form a coalition between my view and that of the others. Yeah, coalition governments don't work too good, I find. And I have anticipated this before. It's not the first time it's been offered to me. Steve Stitch once said we should hook up and have his early mind-reading theory attached to mine. I have other reasons I didn't go into in this lecture for thinking that that won't work. And if I was honest, one of my big worries, which is the current work I'm doing for my next MIT book, concerns whether we really think that there are mental representations of the sorts that many people in cognitive science believe. So there's maybe you know this, a big trend in cognitive science now towards more embodied and active approaches that don't model these on propositional style thinking. And if that's right, and I tend to think it is, then there is no need for a coalition. So we can have sensitivity. I do agree that there's an unexplained gap. The narrative practice hypothesis does not try to explain all of the characteristic ways that we are aware of or recognize other minds. So there's something that has to go in that place. And many people have opted to put forward weaker versions of the theory of mind hypothesis. But I think when they go weak enough, they find that they have a stronger competitor from these non-representational stories. So I'm going to resist that for now.
Yes, I'd like to press you a bit further on that, actually. I think you kind of got out a little bit easily.
Okay.
I mean, basically, I take your point, and I think your theory is very, very interesting. But I think, again, I go back to the point made about the somewhat binary between the theory of mind capacities and your own narrative theory. I mean, surely we have evolved a capacity to absorb these narratives and to understand them, and that they can be imprinted on our mind. Rather like a way of saying, isn't your theory rather like saying that we can write a story without having paper to write it on, in the same way as that a stone cannot understand, doesn't have a theory of mind? Mm-hmm. Is there not something of a way in which evolution will have developed this capacity to understand these narratives? So in a way, the difference between yourself and the theory of mind is not as wide as perhaps you're suggesting. Yeah,
I had once, you didn't get this treat, I have a slide with a Cyberman popping up at a certain point where they say, "You will be like us." And my fear is that once you run this story, people who promote the theory of mind view want to absorb the account I want to give suddenly into theirs. But let's look at specifically one point of difference. The rules that integrate our understanding are what gave the theory of mind theorists their strongest arguments. So when it was first advanced, the idea was that what really makes us believe that there should be a theory is that we have a coordinated systematic account that shows how the mental states interrelate. I think if you look at what I was saying, and I think this gives some solace to people when they hear it, that I don't think the children come without any understanding of minds. In fact, I even think they have a partial understanding on the concept of belief, which is often seen to be the watershed notion. However, and this is the crucial part which I emphasized also throughout the lecture, if you only had the concept of belief and could apply a belief in certain contexts, but you couldn't understand how beliefs related to desires, then a lot of those rules that we thought were explicitly known tacitly, I use that carefully, explicitly known at some level, but tacit, so they're actually written into the module's machinery, well then those rules can't be what's explaining what's going on. So I reject the idea, and I would go for other reasons as well, that we have to have some kind of theory of mind capacity that's built in order simply to be able to respond to others in appropriate ways. But I do accept, absolutely, that we have inherited capacities. So I don't think this is not, it's not placing everything into the narratives. But what it places back in the capacities that we inherit is not a theory of mind device. So I would argue.
Thank you, my lovely. Okay, I mean, I have, this isn't really that, well, okay, I mean, about the analysis of how we voted about the two theories, I mean, don't you think some of us would have rather voted for both of them, like me? Because I think both are equally valid in their own ways. I mean, something may not be valid or invalid in of by itself, but it might be valid in some ways and invalid in some other ways, don't you think? I mean, the theory of mind module has just as much credibility as the narrative practice module. It just needs more proof, don't you think?
Well, if it can get more proof, then I'm in trouble. But I think that the two positions exclude each other when you understand that they're vying competitively for the same space. If we're talking about what integrates the understanding of these capacities, then it can't be that there's a power sharing where both of these abilities do it. And I think deciding on the issue, that's why I wanted to raise the issue about the stakes at the end. It's conceivable, well, let's work this through. If we believe that the theory of mind was right in the sense that they have the rules built in, then the capacity that I'm describing as a kind of icing on the cake from the narratives can't be explaining the integrative rules, these abilities to put these concepts together. So they mutually exclude one another. So I don't think that the issue, again, I think it relates to the previous question, is one in which we could just put the two together and say they both have merits and demerits. However, it's true that both of the theories could be false.
Hello, yeah, thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting. I was interested in the notion it's like the narrative theory is sort of kind of a response to the modular theory, and I'm just interested in something a bit more paradigmatic in the sense of, you know, the response is still discursive. It's something on top of the idea that we see someone and then we make a kind of narrative or discursive interpretation of what's happening. Now, there are other ideas here that maybe there's something kind of about intersubjectivity embodiment, and I'm wondering if you've got any ideas about that, because that's kind of deconstructing the foundational narrative of the paradigm. Yeah.
Well, sort of, and funnily enough, the intersubjective embodied approaches to intersubjectivity is something both Sean Gallagher and I work on all the time. You may know him. In fact, tomorrow, after this, we're beginning another grant that runs until 2014 called Towards a Science of Embodied Intersubjectivity. So actually, this is precisely the kind of thing that I would put in place of the theory of mind modules to explain. Sorry. No. No, I think that we can have ways of interrelating people that aren't at all discursive. And I think that what gets built on top of that, when we have a more discursive mode, is the narrative mode. So that's the replacement for the theory of mind story at the base. So I have a more comprehensive vision of how this plays out, which is precisely why I don't want to. Well, the narrative, so let me be clear. I think the high-level capacity to understand ourselves and others is grounded in narratives, and that does become discursive. But you asked me what came before it, and I say there that I think it's quite possible to have something that doesn't involve representations. So I think children have non-discursive ways of interrelating with others before they have this capacity, and this scaffolds that and builds upon it. So I have a two-stage story. But in no place in this story do I find room for the theory of mind hypothesis. Again, I haven't exhausted all my arguments against theory of mind modules. This was only a taster. But if you're interested, there are several books outside.
There was a question down here, I think.
Hi, Dan. What actually did surprise me about the story you told is, what I like most about what you say is that if you're using stories, it seems you can make room for context, which I think is actually very important in telling why somebody did something, because the reason for today may not be the reason for tomorrow. Whilst with theories of mind, at least the way you presented it, it seems to be more like an algorithm where you can't actually just input the stuff. I was quite surprised that you didn't say more about context and the fact that your narrative hypothesis actually allows you to do that, rather than necessarily as an answer to the theories of mind.
Thank you for letting me do it in questions. There are special reasons why I couldn't fit more into this presentation. I was advised strongly to keep down and make sure that I got out of here on time. But no, I do think that context and, in fact, variability is one of the issues. You're entirely right. I think exposure to narratives, one of the advantages of this approach is that it enables you to see not just the basic rules, although I emphasize that in the talk, you're entirely right, but moreover the particulars. We see many, many, many different cases with many, many different particular characters. So we learn something about how and when to use these capacities sensitively. And that is, I think, an issue that even hardcore theory of mind defenders have admitted is something they have to additionally to explain on their account, which hasn't yet been explained how this would be done. So, for example, the knowledge that the London cabbie has is contextual to a particular environment. And something like that would be too particularized to be inherited, as opposed to a base capacity to navigate streets generally. And so that's, I think, exactly the kind of difference that the accounts give. Thank you for that.
What happens, well, first of all, I'm a bit concerned that we see autism as a dysfunction. But if we put that aside, I teach English and I have autistic students who are able to analyse literature to a very high level, which means understanding characters' beliefs and motivations. But I suspect that they have a different theory of mind which relies on logic rather than something innate, which means that whatever they can do with a novel, they're not able to apply to real life. So that suggests to me the two theories can exist side by side.
Well, it's interesting you put it this way. the idea of a modular built-in theory of mind is not something that's an explicit theory of mind that you might forge. In fact, it is the case that there have been studies done where they have trained autistic individuals to pass the false belief test and taught them the principles. But as you say, and Temple Grandin, I think, has some of these high-level theory of mind capacities. And there's several articles that actually talk about who has a theory of mind. And they suggest that as a compensatory device, rules of thumb can be built in order to get around a kind of core, what's often talked about as a core deficit. What's interesting, though, is that notion of a theory of mind isn't the same as the one that I was just tilting against in the talk. That's not the built-in capacity that's supposed to be tacit and operative in most of us when we do engage in our daily dealings. So that seems to be, of course my thesis is compatible with the existence of that sort of theory of mind. That's the kind of thing that you might build if you had difficulties actually engaging with others. The question is, though, I didn't get to talk about this, but it's possible that some interventions, social stories interventions, have made a difference. And of course, autism is a wide spectrum, so people's abilities differ across that range. So there are many different sorts of interventions, and there are lower order ones to pick up this point earlier about embodied intersubjectivity, such as relation developmental therapy, where we alter the interactions to see if we can kind of bring online some of more of the basic capacities to interrelate. So I think there's several different areas in which we might pursue the question, in what sense might somebody have a theory of mind?
We've just got time for a couple more questions. There's one at the back there, okay. And then I'm going to come down here.
Hello. Listening to your narrative theory, I was reminded very much of hearing Susan Blackmore talking about memes and memetics. And the two, in some ways, seem to fit together quite neatly, except you're talking about the conscious storytelling of a parent to a child, perhaps, and hers have got these insidious little ideas that creep into your mind without you noticing. And I wondered if you thought about how the two fitted together, if they did, because it seemed to me you could almost pile one on the other and get this sort of science fiction-y type scenario where...
Yeah. I don't want to promote memes as such, but there's a view proposed some while back, but also most recently again by Kim Strelny, known as the scaffolded mind view, which plays on the idea that humans have their own cognitive niche, that we build our own niches in this way. So there's structures. So I think of the narratives, I think I gestured at this a little bit with the spiderweb example, that what we're building up here are environments that we interact with, that these environments are part of social practice, are very important to how we shape and what we are. I think if you think about that, it's not so much that they're memes, particular ideas, but structures that are capacity building. And what's really important about that, I think, is that we should watch with some care how we alter our practices, because the thought here is that that would be, in many important ways, altering ourselves and our own possibilities. So what we're doing here is, if we let go of some of the things that we traditionally did, we may find ourselves very different sorts of people. So that's the difference. I don't think it's the same as the meme theory, which has a lot of problems. Okay, Sam.
Thanks, Dan. I was going to ask a nice question.
No, go ahead and ask what you want.
I see that I don't need to, because you had some nice ones. Are you sure you really believe in minds at all? It seems like what you might be trying to do is kind of export things that properly belong to the mind into the environment and into social practices. Yeah. So I'm interested to know what you think the minds are that are kind of intrinsic to us.
If this is the last question, I have to ask this. What do you mean by minds? But yes, that's going to be my response. You're right about the direction, but the traditional Cartesian notion of a mind, yes, it's at risk in my view. So that's probably right. But I don't deny that there are feelings, experiences, beliefs, desires, etc. I just don't think they're housed in individual egos. They're more communal. That's exactly right. So unfortunately, David Cameron may be right. We're living in the big society already. Yes, here.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring things to a close, and I'm sure that over some refreshments a little bit later on, Dan will be still prepared to take any further questions or comments. that you might have. At home, I have a print which I bought years ago when I was teaching in Australia. It's by a Canadian printmaker, and it's called Philosophers at Work. And it consists of 5 philosophers all sitting by a river, and all they're doing is pondering. And I forget quite often just how, and I think that little exchange with Sam has sort of brought it back to mind, how important, obviously, to the philosophical process combat is.
Yeah.
And my hat goes off to Dan for the way in which he's put himself on the line this evening and been prepared to use an event like this to defend a position and to defend it very robustly and in a very intriguing way. What also intrigues me, and something I'm going to be taking away with me today, particularly as somebody who comes from the literary and performing arts, is this dwelling on the centrality of narrative in everything that we do and the way in which our thoughts are shaped and our understanding of others is shaped. And finally, just to also draw attention to the point that Dan himself made, that what we have here is what I think is an increasingly important mission within higher education and within the university, within the academy today, which is this bridging between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences, and that debate, that confrontation, that sort of discussion across those parameters, across those borders, I think is more important now than it has ever been. Dan, thank you for a fascinating and entertaining and intriguing lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.